Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 1285, Ananke. Ananke greets the children of Weaver. The word hung in the air. Sunny and Nephi's glanced at each other warily, both confused by this strange situation. Why was the old woman prostrating in front of them? Why had she addressed them as children of Weaver? What is going on? Sunny was tired out of his mind, and the inexplicable nature of the strange old woman was simply too much for him to process. She didn't seem hostile, at least. With a sigh, he allowed his exhausted body to collapse and sat down on the wooden deck of the ketch. Nephi's, meanwhile, hesitated for a few moments, then took several steps forward and carefully pulled the old woman up. "Please rise, grandmother. Do not bow on our account, responsible for the great calamity that had befallen Earth. Or maybe for its salvation." Regardless, old Ananke seemed to have a deep connection to Weaver, and the owner of the ketch, Ananke, allowed herself to be gently pulled into a sitting position. Then, Nephi's returned to Sunny and sat side by side with him. The two of them were now facing the old woman, waiting for her to say something. But she remained silent. After a few moments passed, Sunny frowned. He felt nervous. There was no telling just how powerful this woman was, and what her intentions were. Ananke was a complete mystery. She could also provide answers to many mysteries that had plagued him. "So," he asked, "I am sorry, grandmother. But why did you call us the children of Weaver?" There were many questions he wanted to ask, but this one was the most pressing. Its answer could explain how old Ananke would treat them. The old woman took a deep sigh, then spoke in her thin, creaky voice, "Because you are the chosen of the nightmare spell. You are a miracle. Your existence is Weaver's triumph." A proud smile appeared on her lips. It was warm and almost motherly. As though she was indeed a grandmother looking at her young, beautiful grandchildren. Sunny took a deep breath, feeling embarrassed. Weaver's triumph. He was all but certain that the nightmare spell had been created by the demon of fate. Now, the last, tiny sliver of doubt had disappeared. Weaver was indeed the being responsible for the great calamity that had befallen Earth. Or maybe for its salvation. Regardless, old Ananke seemed to have a deep connection to Weaver and the nightmare spell. She was also, most likely, one of the people they had wanted to find, a native inhabitant of the Great River. One of the ancient people who had entered the tomb of Ariel before the gods fell. But wouldn't it mean that she had come to the Great River before the spell was created? Things were still not making any sense. As if reading his thoughts, Nephi's leaned forward and asked as politely as she could, "Forgive me for asking, but who are you, grandmother?" Ananke smiled. What she said next made both Sunny and Nephi's flinch. "I am Ananke, the priestess of the nightmare spell." In the silence that followed, the old woman gently shook her head. "It must be hard for you to imagine, my lord and lady. You come from a time when the nightmare spell has matured and rules unopposed, its blessings given freely to all. But it wasn't always like that. At the beginning, which was also the end, when the nightmare spell was still in its infancy, there was a need for people like me to tend to it, protect it. And, above all, to help it spread, so that it could grow stronger." Her wrinkled face grew somber, and a heavy sigh escaped from her lips. Which wasn't easy. Wasn't easy at all. After all, we, the followers of a daemon, were deemed heretics and persecuted by servants of the gods. All were despised, many were hunted down and put to death. Well, not that I experienced any of that myself. Every sentence the old woman spoke was a revelation, and they followed one after another. There were so many startling pieces of information she was sharing freely with them that Sunny found himself unable to digest it all. He felt like a person who was drowning in a deep sea after spending years dying from thirst in the desert. Priestess of the nightmare spell. The beginning that was also the end. Must be the early stages of the war between the demons and the gods. Wait, the spell was not created as it is today. It had to grow. Be grown, even. Persecuted by the gods. What? He was failing desperately to keep up, tired as he was. Nephi's was struggling, too, but it seemed as though she had a slightly better grasp of the conversation. White sparks ignited in her eyes. "So, our existence is proof that the suffering of the followers of Weaver was not meaningless. That the nightmare spell you worshipped and proselytized has realized its great design. river, which flowed from the future into the past, would have had a different. Ananke nodded and looked at them with reverence, which made both feel uncomfortable. Indeed. You are very wise, my lady. Nephi's remained silent for a few moments, then remarked evenly, you don't seem to be surprised by the fact that we come from the future. Sunny forced himself to focus. It was a very poignant question, and one that he had failed to think of himself, distracted by the avalanche of revelations. The old woman slowly nodded, her breath ragged. It seemed that it was hard for her to speak for so long, but she still forced herself to answer, of course, I am not surprised. Haven't you come from upstream, my lord and lady? Nephi's and Sunny glanced at each other. They had indeed. The natives of the great river, which flowed from the future into the past, would have had a different perception of time. For them, people from the future might not seem that strange. Ananke took a breath, then added tiredly, oh, but I was also warned that you would come. Huh. That was perhaps the most shocking revelation yet. After a moment of silence, Sunny raised an eyebrow while hiding how shaken he truly was. Warned. How? The old woman nodded again, her unbound white hair moving in the wind. I received a message. In my dreams. A message that the children of Weaver would come. And that. She paused for a few moments, catching her breath, then finished fervently, and that I must help them reach Fallen Grace, where Dusk, the last of the Sibyls, reigns. Chapter 1286, Fortuitous Encounter Dusk. Sibyl of the Fallen Grace. Sunny shivered. Of course, he remembered who Dusk was. He was wearing a tunic called Shroud of Graceless Dusk, after all, the transcendent memory of the 6th tier he had received for slaying the terror of LO-49. That damned horror. If he were to try and assign numbers to the enemies he had faced in Antarctica based on how many mental scars they left him with, the beautiful flower of floating white silk would be squarely placed second, right behind the winter beast. Even Goliath, who had literally killed him, did not leave as harrowing of an impression. Of course, Dusk was most likely neither dead nor corrupted yet in the nightmare. She was still a human, and seemed to be ruling a place called Fallen Grace. Since Sunny and Nephi's wanted to reach the civilization of the Great River and find the Sibyls, this destination was perfect. It was a little bit too perfect, even. Ananke had answered one of the most important questions they had. The improbable coincidence of them finding her catch just when they needed it was no coincidence at all. She had come knowingly, expecting to find them. But who was it that had instructed her where to find them? In her dreams, no less. Who was pulling the strings of this nightmare behind the scenes? Is it, perhaps, the last Sibyl herself? Sunny frowned, knowing that he would not find the answer any time soon. The earliest opportunity was probably going to be when he came face to face with the Sibyl of the Fallen Grace. Again. He sighed. Fallen Grace. How far is that? Old Ananke hesitated for a few moments. It is far. Very, very far. So far that I won't be able to guide you all the way there. She grew silent, her eyes closing slightly. It almost seemed as though she had dozed off. Then, however, the old woman shook slightly, and added, but I will take you as far as I can go, my lord and lady. Ah. You see, we Daemon followers weren't welcome here, in Ariel's tomb, either. They chased us away, and we traveled upstream for a long time before settling down and building Weave. Weave. It's one of the human cities on the Great River, like Fallen Grace. Or, at least, it used to be. Sunny and Nephi's looked at each other. Why was it that Ananke was unable to return downstream? Was there some kind of internal strife between the locals of the Great River? Would it be dangerous for her to enter the waters controlled by the Sibyls? And what did she mean, that we've only used to be a city? Nephi spoke cautiously, we wouldn't want to put you in danger, grandmother. The old woman smiled. Helping you is both my wish and privilege, my lady. Do not worry about me. I am of the Great River. Her speech was slowing down, and her words became slurred. It was obvious that the old woman was growing too tired to continue the conversation. She seemed to have understood that, too. With a soft sigh, Ananke raised her hands. In the next moment, Sunny and Nephi's both stared in bewilderment as a whirlwind of white sparks appeared in the air. She is summoning a memory. This action, which was so mundane and familiar to them, looked infinitely strange and out of place when performed by one of the ancient humans. It was the ability of those infected by the spell, after all, and no one they had met in all the nightmares possessed it. Soon, a wooden box appeared on the deck in front of them. Ananke opened it with shaking hands and took out several items. A beautifully embroidered tablecloth, a carafe of wine, a painted ceramic teapot with steam rising from its spout, 2 small cups, and 2 plates, one full of ripe fruits, the other full of small savory pies. The fruits were succulent, and the pies looked freshly cooked. The items were simple and modest, even worn out a little, yet lovingly maintained. A delicious smell spread through the air. Ananke carefully placed everything on the tablecloth and offered the food to Sunny and Nephi's. "My lord, my lady. You must be tired after braving the horrors of the future. Please, eat and rest. I will guide us back to Weave, first." She took a deep breath, then slowly rose to her feet and walked back to the helmsman's bench with effort. Sitting down on it, the old woman tiredly lowered her head and whispered several strange, ineligible words. In the next moment, the ketch suddenly moved. The midnight-colored sails rose by themselves and billowed in the wind, while the steering oar swayed, turning the bow of the boat downstream. Soon, they were sailing across the sparkling expanse of the great river, slowly gaining speed. Sunny and Nephi's hesitated for a bit. Both of them were completely exhausted and incredibly hungry, but they still did not trust the old woman. What if the food was poisoned? What if she was waiting until they fell asleep to kill them? Sunny glanced at the frail figure of the priestess. She looked too fragile and weak to pose any threat to them. Of course, looks could be deceiving. But he also felt that Ananke had been sincere and treated them with nothing except great benevolence. It was hard to dislike or distrust the kind, earnest old woman. Whatever. Even if she had done something to the food, he was very hard to poison. Blood we've made him all but immune to most toxins, after all. Shaking off the mad desire to devour everything in sight, the faint remnant of the ferocious form of the river serpent, he tentatively picked up a savory pie, still warm from the oven, and took a bite. His hand trembled. Delicious. So delicious. Not wasting any more time, Sunny sent the whole pie into his mouth and chewed greedily. A few moments later, he raised his thumb and nudged Nephi's with his elbow. She lingered for a moment, then followed his example. They ate and drank like 2 kids being spoiled by their grandmother, oblivious to everything else. Soon, the entire meal disappeared. They didn't even spare the wine. After that, Sunny felt incredibly sleepy. But it wasn't the unnatural feeling of having been drugged. It was simply the natural reaction of his abused body demanding some well-deserved and much-needed rest. Safe. We're safe, I think. Struggling to keep his eyes open, Sunny looked at Nephi's. She was tired, too, and yet she nodded to answer his silent question. "It's all right. I'll take the first watch." "You can." Before she even finished the sentence, Sunny had already dropped his head on her lap, fast asleep.